So you can see the title there. Yeah, so there are the weed spawners, the fish that spawn on weed, and the cyprinids in this country mainly are classic. And then, of course, we have the gravel spawners, other cyprinids such as barbel and bleak and dace and chub, and of course these spotty things as well called trout that you might have heard of. Some fish, some cyprinids, like the member of the Taurinii subfamily, good examples of how fish use whole rivers. I spend a lot of time in India, and these golden marcia will run entire rivers. I mean, when the monsoon floods are going, and there are boulders the size of trucks rolling down the rivers that are otherwise dry, these fish spawn, they surge up the rivers, spawn, and as the flows go down from torrential to zero, you see the fry moving down the river and growing until the adults go down to the big pools to ride out the winter. Fish life cycles, I'm going to start with roach, which are a bit of a personal obsession. They spawn on vegetation April and June, and they grow very rapidly, but from a slow start. So it's a classic sigmoid growth curve. In the first summer, they can put on 30% of their body weight a day. They are grazing like crazy initially on diatoms and then rotifers and cladocerans and whatever. And they're probably the length of a thumb by the end of the first year. And they grow and they grow. And suddenly they explode. You probably be aware of Trev and Budge's Avon Roach project. And they showed me some of the tanks. And Trev was saying, why is it that in the first 2 years they go slow, 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 and suddenly the growth explodes? And I put my hand in the juvenile tank, and there were water snails on my hand. I put it in the 3-year-old's tank, and there were no snails, because the diet is gape limited. Once they are big enough, they can pick up these protein-rich, bite-sized little snails, and the growth curve accelerates like crazy. The diet of the roach is incredibly catholic. Everything from algae to a range of invertebrates, detritus, depending on the season. Again, you'll be familiar when I'm talking to students. They say, "Is that a tree ring?" Well, yes, it is. It's exactly the same principle of growth spurts in warm and abundant food, and then halting in the winter. That's from a roach that was 13 years old. It was a very big one. It's a drawing of a photo of a slide. Then after 3 years, exceptionally 2 years, your average cyprinid can then mature and spawn. The crucians that I grow at home, the ones that are in the pond, they'll spawn at 3 years, but the ones that are in my tanks indoors that I put out in the spawning season, they'll spawn at 2 years because they don't have that growth hiatus. But they mature and grow on. And the life cycle of the cyprinid is barbel and roach spawning on the weeds, and the barbel in the gravel. They lay their eggs in the spring. The embryos develop what they call free embryos. These fish spawn without their guts complete, without their fins formed, a sucker on the head to stick to a bit of vegetation or a rock, and they digest their yolk sac. And over the period of a few weeks at different growth temperatures, they develop into proper little fish. They are really not, they don't have guts, they don't have fins, they don't have so many vital body organs when they're first hatched. And then after 3 or 4 years, they spawn. But there's a seasonal double whammy here. In that, if you get a cold, frosty winter with poor feeding, you get very little yolk. That is not a fish yolk, which you're probably aware of. That is a chicken yolk, just to give the sense. And so right from the previous months, the recruitment the next year can be compromised because of the lack of yolk in the egg, and the larvae are prejudiced from birth. And then if you get a cold summer, the abundance of desmids and chironomids, bloodworms, and so forth can compromise. So you can have failure of recruitment. And you'll probably be aware that with chub, you can have 1 year class that's really strong in a river and then almost nothing, and then another strong growth curve, because they're so dependent on this seasonal double whammy. Cold winter, cold summer can mean no recruitment for many of these species. Whereas a summer like we had after a not particularly cold winter, this is probably going to be a bumper crop of particularly cyprinid fry. And particularly then, at the end of the year, if you've got compromised fry because of lack of yolk and then lack of good feeding, they can be washed out in the spate and just go to feed the bass, basically. So that's your basic growth cycle. And then you've got these complex occupations of space and time. So the gravel spawners are going to be segregated from the weed spawners, but there's segregation in terms of time. So the dace are amongst the first spawners of the year, of the cyprinids, and that's typically end of February, early March. They go up to the gravels and they'll spawn. Whereas the chub, the barbel, the roach, the bream, and so forth, they are late spring spawners. So interestingly, dace don't hybridize. I mean, it's just not known. Whereas the other roach, chub, dace, barbel, not so much barbel, they're a different subfamily, but the chub, the roach, the bream tend to form hybrids as well as the bleak. But of course, some fish tune into this seasonality, and the pike spawn very early so that the little predators are there to eat the fry of the others as we go round the cycle of the year. People are often ask me, why do you get so many hybrids in reservoirs and canals? And the Kenneton Avon that I fish is full of hybrids of everything, silver bream and rudd hybrids, roach and bream hybrids, and so forth. And the answer is very simply that there's competition for spawning habitat. Suitable habitat is very much limited, and so all of these scatter spawners are competing for space, and so you get the hybridization. Other fish spawn on hard substrates. The bullhead spawns, the male establishes a cave and attracts in females, and they spawn on the roof of the cave. And the perch spawns on hard surfaces, often overhanging boughs or roots from trees on the river edge. They're quite common. Cichlids in the tropical world, they're generally rock or hard surface spawners, with a lot of exceptions actually. Zander are also another hard surface spawner as well. And then you have the various species that don't scatter spawn but show advanced brood care. We've mentioned the bullhead on the left there. A bullhead can live under the same rock for all its life. So as a kid, we used to turn over the stones and catch the bullhead. Vital to put the stone back exactly where it was. And the males attract the adjacent females. They spawn on the roof of the cave, and the male protects those eggs. Likewise, you'll be familiar with the stickleback, the way the male forms a weedy nest with spigin, a protein secreted from the kidney, attracts in a number of females, broods those eggs, cares for the fry until they're free swimming. So it's not just scatter spawning. The cichlids particularly are advanced parental care, largely across the whole family. The invasive species like the topmouth gudgeon and the sunbleak, they show a degree of parental care, which explains why they're so competitive. And of course, they eat the eggs and fry of other fish as well. And their brood care is very much part of their success strategy. And there's some evidence that Zander do a level of brood care. I think the jury's slightly out, but it seems that they do. Some of the more advanced brood care is seen in the mouth brooders. This wonderful cichlid at the top. I think it's a fantastic photo. But for many, many years, I kept the fish on the bottom right there, the Pseudocrenulabrus multicolour, the dwarf Egyptian mouth brooder. And I kept them for many, many years. I haven't got any anymore because nowadays they're very rare because of other species, particularly Nile perch, that have wiped out a lot of the native populations. And often what you see in tropical fish shop is actually the Pseudocrenulabrus philander, which is a different species although it's still sold as the dwarf Egyptian mouth brooder. Then you have the brood care of the anabantids, which build a bubble nest. The male, in this case, Siamese fighting fish, builds a bubble nest, and that's where he attracts females, and they have this lovely embrace, and it squeezes the eggs, and the male fertilizes them, picks up the eggs in his mouth and spits them into the nest. And he stays and broods that nest and looks after the fry until they're free swimming. So there's a different strategy for the anabantids there that involves using the surface of the water, the bubble nest, but advanced brood care. So they don't need to lay a million eggs like a sunfish. They can put their effort into protecting a much smaller level. The snakeheads also do this. Some bubble nest spawn, others more conventional spawn. But one of the things that people who fish for snakeheads often do is they look for a little orange mass or pinky mass in the water, and that's a shoal of fry with both parents circulating and guarding it. Now, I caught this in a different sort of way because I didn't really want to break up a family, but popping a lure across, then the snakehead parents hit it hard as a potential predator of the fry. And these are fish are fairly seriously armed with teeth at the front end, which is why I'm holding it on a fish gripper with a walk the dog plug. You don't want to put your hand anywhere near that. Other amazing brood care is shown, for example, with the splashing characin. These fish, they've got these, lovely big fins. That's not an artificially bred one. They do look like that. And the male will guard an area of water under an overhanging branch and attract the female, and they jump and momentarily stick to the leaves, and they release their egg and molt and then drop back in the water. But the eggs stick to the overhanging vegetation, and the female's driven away, but the male stays there. And they're called splashing characin for a good reason. Every now and again, he's splashing to keep the eggs wet. And those eggs are protected, obviously, from predators in the water, other fish and large invertebrates and so forth. And when they hatch, they'll drop in, and the fish, the juvenile fish, then live the rest of their lives independently. But, wonderful strategies to protect the fry, or the eggs and the fry. Then we have the cuckoos. They're a species of mouth-brooding cichlids, particularly in Lake Tanganyika, but there are elsewhere as well. There are cichlids that, when the females laid the eggs and the males fertilize them, then the male, generally the male, picks up the eggs in his mouth and broods them. We saw that in a previous photo. But some of these fish then rush in, lay their own eggs, so that when the male picks up the eggs to brood, the male is protecting the spawn of a different species completely. And there's a few cichlids do that. And there's even a species of cuckoo catfish who basically brood parasitizes the cichlids. The catfish rushes in, drops its eggs, and the cichlids protect them in the mouth. Other species, Japanese perch and this little goby type species, they kind of lay their eggs where other species are guarding eggs. So it's not a mouth brooding one, but these are both Japanese fish. So there's parasitism of brood care. One that probably we were familiar with, those of us obsessed with fish as youngsters, the famous bitterling. And the male there finds a suitable, generally a swan mussel, and protects it, attracts females, and the females grow this prolonged ovipositor like the fish on the left, puts it into the mantle cavity through the breathing tubes of the mussel, lays eggs, and the male releases his molt. And then the eggs attach to the gills of the mussel, and they're protected from predation, but also mussels, when you get a drought, they'll move through the sediment and they'll take themselves and their burden of eggs out of the drying zone. So it's a very protective strategy. And there is a quid pro quo because the Glaucidia larvae of the mussel, they're like a spring trap. And they come out into the water and they latch onto the gills of fish. We know that pearl mussel do this to trout and salmon. And so the fish is protecting the larvae of the mussel and distributing the larvae of the mussel as well. So it's a nice little case of quid pro quo with reproductive strategies there. There's other fish species, the capellan in the Atlantic coast, the grunion in the Pacific coast, the grass puffer mainly in the southern hemisphere. They wait for a super high tide, throw themselves on the beach. The eggs get ingrained into the sand or the sediment or between the rocks. And then the fish, well, a lot of them get picked off by gulls actually, but they go back on the high tide. And then the next spring tide, when the water is up, the fry emerge. So it's actually, the eggs are protected by living in wet sediment completely out the water. Amazing, amazing strategies that they have. Then, of course, we have the ovoviviparous, the fish that retain the eggs. And the male guppy here, you'll be familiar with the guppy, the anal fin is evolved into a gonopodium. And that inseminates the female. The eggs mature in the female. And the female releases live eggs. I've got tanks of guppies, 3 of them around my house, because I think they're just fascinating. And they're easy to keep. They even survive me. But they're far from the only fish that's ovoviviparous. This is a smoothhound. And there's a smoothhound at the bottom, smoothhound pup from the beach. You find the smoothhounds moving into certain places in the spring to drop their pups. And it saves that vulnerable egg stage being out in the open. And then you have what I call love to death, the classic life cycles of several Pacific salmon species that come up rivers, spawn and die. And I just couldn't get my head around this as a kid. How does that work? How do you proliferate a species by dying? But the answer is very simple. The adults are at sea and they're packing on weight and they're packing on nutrition and they're picking up nutrients from fish fry, from krill. They forge the rivers and they bring with them all that productivity from the sea in these very nutrient poor rivers. And something like a fifth or a quarter of the nitrogen in the leaves of the trees of the forest actually derive from the sea. So they're a major, major nutrient pump. That's essential for the parr and then the smolts to go back, because otherwise there just would not be enough food there. So death is a way of giving life to the next generation. Now, we all probably get accosted by people telling us that, oh, ducks carry weed and the eggs are on the weed, and that's how new waters get populated. There is not a shred of evidence to suggest that that's possible. And ducks are very streamlined. You don't see ducks trailing a bunch of weed behind them. But ducks probably have a role to play. And we're just learning some of this. So for a weed spawning species, of course, ducks are eating the weed. And of course, they're ingesting the eggs. And some of those eggs, for some species, can survive the digestive tract of a duck. It's a process known as endozoochory. Of course, we know this is the case for seeds, but actually seeing it happen with animals is an interesting, relatively recent bit of proof. And there are papers showing that Cyprinus carpio, the common carp, and Carassius gibelio, the gibel, produce a subset of viable embryos that hatch out into fish when mallards have been fed on vegetation with fish eggs on them. So this is demonstrated in the lab, but it does demonstrate the possibility. And there's suspicion that this happens with some killifish and possibly perch as well, although that's circumstantial evidence. Now, my least favorite fish in the galaxy, actually, yeah, common carp, I don't like them either, but this is the aforementioned gibel. the Carassius gibelio, which is spreading like wildfire. And it's in the UK now, amongst other competing Carassius species. And it really is a potential big problem. They have this amazing life strategy that makes them particularly dangerous, actually. As Peter Rolfe says, you only need one fish to cause a plague, because they produce eggs, and the eggs require sperm to trigger them, but they don't care whose, because the sperm from other species doesn't fuse with the ovum, but it triggers the genesis of the ovum. And so you end up with a rapid buildup of clones of Geibel. So anyone that's been to the continent particularly and caught Geibel, they all look identical. And there's a good reason. They are literally clones. You don't actually need a male to cause just an infestation, which makes them particularly dangerous because of hybridization and a major threat to crucians, Carassius carassius. So that is a problem. But this process of gynogenesis, it's known in some amphibians and reptiles, self-fertilization, but the Geibel is probably unique in terms of the fish, possibly unique. Another fish that fascinates me, and I've been involved in the attempts to reintroduce it into the UK because it went extinct in my lifetime. 1969 was the last verified specimen, or the one was reported in 1970 in Angling Times. This is the last verified specimen. It's in Cambridge University, the Zoology Museum, and we had a workshop this June about trying to promote the reintroduction. It's been going on for years, and this was the latest in it. Now, people say, oh, it's a cold water species, it spawns in the winter, and therefore it's climate change. Well, it isn't climate change. Go read my book. It's a slam dunk that is not the cause. It doesn't actually help, but it's not the smoking gun. The smoking gun is that this species is a member of the gadiforms, the order of codfishes, and it breeds in the cold in midwinter after Christmas. A lot of the research stations where burbot are financially or commercially important are based on ice lake populations in Alaska, North America. However, there are many genetic strains across the wide sort of circumpolar range of this species, and there are wild existing stock of burbot way further south than the UK, particularly in the Seine in France and a few German rivers, way further south than us. And the riverine strain is not this big behemoth of a fish that you get in Alaska and Scandinavia and a few other places, but they inhabit like trout type streams. And they forge a long way up the river, and they spawn in inundated floodplains that are basically inundated for months. So the eggs are planktonic, the larvae are planktonic, and after 2 months, then they become benthic and they live out on the bed of the river or the lake. Now, the question is, can you tell me, A, where the ice lakes are in the UK? We never had them. Or secondly, where there are inundated floodplains for a period of 2 months. We got rid of them from Roman times onwards, and particularly after the Second World War period, and that the absolute crash of burbot numbers was in that mass drainage in the post-war period. So Fenland used to be 1,500 square miles of neither fully wet nor fully dry, and that was a stronghold. Now there is basically 1 square mile of proper fen, and that is hydrologically disconnected. It's above the catchment level. We have destroyed the spawning habitat, and the same is true of Yorkshire's forgotten fens, big areas in the north. So we've destroyed the potential spawning habitat of this species, and with it, we've lost the species. We're trying to bring it back in a few places, actually live firing range, military firing range, where no one does any farming. Here's the book that Sean flashed up earlier. Everyone knows that eels spawn in the Sargasso Sea. No one has ever seen an eel in the Sargasso Sea. No one's even seen an eel with testes. We know that European eels come down from Europe towards the Sargasso Sea, and we know that the larvae drift back on the Gulf current. The American eel does very much the same thing and drifts to America. Ours veer right and drift that way. Until the DNA was done, I'd wondered if they were the same species with different morphology. No, they're genetically very distinct. So if they're spawning in the same place, how come the only place you get hybrids is up around Iceland, naturally? How do the hybrids know to go all the way to the north? In the eel conferences, I keep flashing this up saying, this is not the full story, dudes. But still, the faith is, no, they go to the Sargasso Sea. We've just not found them yet. The Sargasso Sea is the only sea in the world without a coast. It's bordered by 4 other seas, which is why there's a big gyre there, and it's very oligotrophic. You know, if you want to have your babies, don't let them grow in an oligotrophic sea, because they've got to eat. So there's much more mystery about the eel, which is one of the things I love about the eel, the mystery of this species over the years. So sort of drawing to a close now, there's so much to be fascinated with about fish. I mean, other than my sustainability and wildlife and other books, I've just written loads of books about fish because they're just so fascinating. But just that we've just sort of tapped the surface of the life cycles and amazing reproductive strategies of fish. And it's sort of a preoccupation for a lifetime, really, just trying to unravel all of that lot. So there it is, what happens when mummy and daddy fish love each other very much.